Welcome to the Deep Dive. You're here because you want to understand the world better, without getting buried in jargon. Today, we're tackling something that might sound a bit dense, but it's actually the hidden foundation of how we think about learning and development, the core beliefs that shape all those different theories you might have heard about. Think of it as understanding the fundamental philosophies behind why different approaches to teaching or understanding the mind even exist.
That's right. You've probably encountered various ideas about how we learn, maybe even wondered why there's so many different perspectives. What we're doing in this deep dive is stepping back to look at the most basic assumptions that these theories are built on. We're drawing on the work of James Burns, who has done some really interesting work in mapping out these underlying beliefs.
Right. So, your mission, should you continue to listen, and you are, is to unpack these fundamental assumptions, what Burns calls meta-theoretical belief systems, or MTBSs. We're going to explore how these core ideas about what knowledge is, where it comes from, and how our minds operate actually influence the learning theories we see in the real world. Consider this your fast track to understanding the big picture of learning without needing to wade through mountains of academic papers. We'll be looking at the key ideas from research that helps us categorize and analyze these different viewpoints.
And what's so valuable for you in understanding these core beliefs is that it not only clarifies why different learning theories exist, but it also provides a framework for thinking about whether we can combine insights from different theories to get more complete understanding of how learning really works.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What exactly are these theories and meta-theoretical belief systems we're talking about?
Well, a theory, simply put, is a network of connected ideas that tries to explain something. In our case, that's how our minds develop and how we learn. Theories make specific claims about what's real, what you might call the basic elements, and they propose models to explain how those elements interact. Think of a scientist observing something and then building a framework to make sense of it.
Can you give us a quick example to make that clear?
Uh,
Something simple.
Sure. Um, Imagine you notice that when you put steel in acid, it dissolves. A theory to explain this wouldn't just say it dissolved. It would propose a model, maybe explaining the interaction between the acid molecules and the iron atoms in the steel to show the underlying process. That model is the how it works part.
Got it. So the theory has the observation and the proposed mechanism. Now, where do these MTBSs come into play?
The meta-theoretical belief systems are the really fundamental philosophies, the core beliefs that guide the thinkers who build those theories. These beliefs do a few important things. First, they lead researchers to investigate certain things and, well, ignore others. For example, behaviorists, especially early on, tended to shy away from studying what goes on inside our minds, like mental imagery. They focused on observable actions.
Ah, so your deepest beliefs can actually shape what you even look for when trying to understand something.
Exactly. Second, these MTBSs define what knowledge itself is seen as. So if you're a structuralist, you'll likely see knowledge as a set of interconnected concepts organized in specific ways. And third, they address where knowledge comes from. Are we born with certain understandings? Nativists would lean that way. Or do we learn everything through experience? That's more the empiricist view.
Okay. So MTBSs are the really deep level assumptions that set the stage for everything else. They're not just about the details of a learning theory, but the basic way someone even thinks about how learning happens.
Precisely. And it's key to realize that these MTBSs are at the heart of any theory. They guide the creation of the more specific ideas we often hear about, like, say, schemata in Piaget's work or productions, those if-then rules in some cognitive models. The MTBS sets the overall direction and the basic building blocks.
So why should we, as people just trying to learn and understand, care about these underlying MTBSs? What's the payoff?
There are a couple of really good reasons. First, it helps you see how different learning theories are connected historically. Theories sharing similar MTBS often have common roots. Second, and maybe most importantly for practical understanding, knowing these MTBSs gives you a way to judge whether different theories or parts of them can be logically combined. Can you build a richer picture by blending them?
That makes a lot of sense, sort of like checking if the fundamental ingredients can actually mix well together. So let's get into these 8 major MTBSs you mentioned. How can we group them to make sense of them?
Right, we can group them based on the main question they're trying to answer. The first group is primarily focused on explaining behavior. That includes behaviorism, neo-behaviorism, and cognitivism. The second group focuses on the form that knowledge takes in our minds. That's structuralism and functionalism. And the third group deals with the origin of knowledge, where it comes from: nativism, empiricism, and constructivism.
Okay, group 1, explaining behavior. Let's start with behaviorism. What's the core idea here? Feels like stimulus response, right?
Pretty much. At its core, behaviorism sees learning as acquiring new responses to things in our environment stimuli. The environment provides the stimuli, our behavior is the response. And a key idea is reinforcement. If a behavior is followed by something positive, you're more likely to do it again. So learning is building these SR reinforcer relationships. Behaviorists generally believe behavior is learned and, importantly, environmentally manipulable.
And what about the mind? Thoughts, feelings, all that internal stuff. What did they think?
Ah, that's a crucial point, and there were different takes. Early on, John B. Watson basically argued that mental entities weren't viable for study. You can't see them, you can't measure them directly.
So just ignore them.
Pretty much, yeah. Then you had methodological behaviorism, most famously associated with B.F. Skinner. This view said, okay, maybe mental stuff exists, but the best explanation for behavior lies in the environmental causes. Stick to what you can observe. Skinner also pushed radical behaviorism. He argued that while mental things exist, we have thoughts, feelings, they don't explain behavior. They're more like side effects or maybe behaviors themselves. Focusing on them distracts from the real cause, the environmental contingencies, the history of reinforcement.
So even if you feel like your concept of cat makes you point at a cat picture, Skinner would say it's really about the history of reinforcement tied to those visual features.
Exactly. He'd say the concept talk is just a shorthand. The real explanation is in the observable environmental history and the response.
Wow, that's a hard line. What came next? How did that evolve?
Well, that leads us to neo-behaviorism. Thinkers like Hull, Berlin, the Kendlers. They felt you couldn't fully explain all behavior just with SR links. They saw a need for internal mental mechanisms mediating between the stimulus and response.
Mediating, like something happening inside the head.
Yes, exactly. They proposed things like implicit stimuli or symbolic responses, basically, internal stand-ins for external things. They argued some experimental results, like how animals and people handle shifts in learning tasks, just couldn't be explained without positing these internal processes.
Okay, so they opened the black box a little bit. You mentioned connectionism earlier as related.
Yeah, connectionism is often seen as a modern version. It also emphasizes internal mechanisms, but instead of clear symbols, it focuses on connections between many simple subsymbolic units. Think of it like a crowd holding up colored cards to make a picture. No single card is the picture, but the pattern of connections creates it. It's about the strengths of connections between simple units, which actually echoes some of Hull's ideas about associative strengths between internal stimuli and responses.
Interesting. So still focused on connections, but maybe more complex distributed ones. Now, how does cognitivism fit in? Was that a break from behaviorism?
Oh, absolutely. Cognitivism really emerged as anti-behaviorism in many ways. Think Chomsky's critique of Skinner or Neisser's book Defining the Field. Cognitivists flat out rejected the idea that you could ignore the mind. They explain behavior by referencing internal mental constructs, plans, goals, schemata, rules, mental models. For cognitivists, mental representations are central, and they causally affect behavior. What matters isn't just the stimulus, but how you interpret it.
So the mind is definitely back in the driver's seat. What's the cognitivist take on where knowledge comes from, though? Are they nativist, empiricist?
You know, that's interesting. As a broad approach, cognitivism itself is actually pretty neutral on the origin question. Its main focus is on the nature and function of the mental representations we have, rather than digging deep into how they got there in the first place.
Yeah.
Different cognitivists might lean one way or the other, but the core MTBS isn't defined by that.
Okay, that makes sense. It's more about the what's happening now inside the head. Which leads us nicely into group 2, focusing on the form of knowledge, structuralism, and functionalism.
Exactly. So, while cognitivism broadly says mental representations matter, structuralism and functionalism zoom in on different aspects of those representations. Structuralism really emphasizes analyzing the nature and organization of our concepts, what you might call conceptual knowledge. Think Piaget in Helder, Chomsky in linguistics. They're interested in the structure of ideas, how they relate.
So like the architecture of knowledge, the categories, the hierarchies, the connections between concepts.
Precisely. Structuralists often use specific tasks to try and reveal this underlying structure, and you often see them use formalisms like logical notation or diagrams to describe these conceptual structures abstractly. Piaget and Inhelder's A plus A for class inclusion is a classic example. It's a formal structure representing a logical relationship.
Like dogs plus non-dogs equals animals.
Something like that, yeah. But it's not always formal. Thinkers like Roche studying prototypes or Carrot looking at conceptual change in kids, They're also structuralist because they focus on the organization of concepts, even without the heavy formalism. And they do use these structures to explain behavior. How you categorize something, for example, depends on your underlying conceptual structure.
Okay, structuralism, the architecture. What about functionalism? Sounds like it's about what we do with the knowledge.
You got it. Functionalism shifts the focus to procedural knowledge, the how-to, and the actual process of thinking. It looks at means-goal analysis, problem-solving steps, often modeled with if-then rules or productions. Functionalists study mental processes like assimilation, how we parse sentences, memory strategies. They're interested in the adaptive, goal-directed aspects of cognition.
So a structuralist might study the concept of space, while a functionalist studies the strategies we use to search for something in that space.
Perfect example. Or a structuralist looks at linguistic categories. A functionalist looks at the grammatical rules for combining them. Structuralist, concept of number. Functionalist, mental calculation steps. Thinkers from the early days like Angel and Dewey up through Piaget's process side, and modern computational guys like Fodor, Anderson, or Siegler looking at problem-solving rules.
It really sounds like these two, structuralism and functionalism, are looking at two sides of the same coin. The stuff we know and how we use it.
They often are very complementary, yes. You really need both. The categories and the rules, the knowledge base and the processing strategies. Incompatibility usually arises when specific theories built on these MTBSs propose conflicting models for the exact same behavior. But the underlying philosophies themselves aren't necessarily opposed.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move to the final group, the origin story. Nativism, empiricism, and constructivism. Nature versus nurture, basically.
In essence, yeah, that's the core tension they address. Nativism is the belief that at least some knowledge is innate, built in. Now, hardly anyone thinks everything is innate. The real differences among nativists are about how much is innate, how it develops or unfolds over time, and the nature of that innate knowledge.
Can you give some flavors of nativism?
Sure. One idea is that the structure of language or the world itself predisposes us to certain concepts. Like, the world has objects that do things, so our language reflects that. Keel and Chomsky touch on this. Another view is parameter setting. We're born with a limited set of possible rules or concepts, and experience sets the switch for which ones get used in our language or understanding. Pinker's work on language acquisition often uses this idea, and some nativists focus on developmental timetables, maybe core concepts like space, time, causality, just mature or unfold on a biological schedule.
So nativism emphasizes the built-in. Empiricism is the opposite end. Everything comes from experience.
Largely, yes. Empiricism argues most knowledge is acquired through exposure to the world. We don't impose pre-existing structures onto it. But again, it's rarely absolute. Even classic empiricists like Hume acknowledged innate capacities, like noticing similarities or things happening together. Thorndike assumed an innate ability to form associations. Modern empiricists might focus less on pure association and more on how we detect statistical regularities in the world, like Roche's idea that prototypes emerge from correlated features we observe. It's still learning from the world, but maybe a more sophisticated kind of pattern detection than simple SR.
Okay, learning from the outside in. Where does constructivism fit? It sounds like it might be a middle ground.
It really is positioned between them. Constructivism says concepts are neither just innate nor simply absorbed from the world. We actively create or invent them through interaction. Thinkers like Piaget, but also others like Fisher or Clark and Wallace. The idea is that we build progressively more complex understandings. Our adult concepts are constructed from earlier, simpler versions.
And Piaget had specific mechanisms for this construction, didn't he?
He did. Piaget's version is very influential. He saw limited innate starting points, basic reflexes, tendencies to adapt and organize, but the main engine of development was equilibration, this drive to resolve conflicts between our current understanding and new experiences. This involves processes like assimilation and accommodation, driven by interaction with the physical and social world. He talked about 4 factors: maturation, equilibration, social interaction, physical experience, but equilibration was really central to the construction process.
Right, the active building process. So these MTBSs are like the philosophical starting points. How do they actually guide the creation of specific theories, like Piaget?
Let's stick with Piaget as an example. His structuralist belief is super clear, right? His whole theory is about stages defined by different underlying logical structures of thought. He even used formal logic to try and describe them. And his constructivist belief is just as evident. He constantly emphasized that children actively build these structures through equilibration, assimilation, accommodation. They aren't just given or innate.
And you said he didn't really borrow from behaviorism.
Exactly. His core beliefs, His MTBS is about wanting to understand the child's own natural logic, and seeing knowledge as actively constructed led him away from models focused just on learned associations or passive absorption. He focused on concepts children seem to invent before formal schooling, which really underscores that constructivist bent. His MTBSs filtered what kinds of explanation that he found plausible.
Okay, I see. The MTBS is like the lens through which a theorist views the world, shaping what they focus on and how they explain it. Now, the big question, combining theories, when does that actually make sense?
Right, we can think about combinations in two ways. Within group and between group. Within group means combining MTBS on the same spectrum, like different tastes on the origin of knowledge. Between group is mixing MTBSs from different categories, like one about origin and one about form.
So within group is about finding a compatible spot on the same dimension, maybe.
Pretty much. Coherence here depends on where they are on the continuum, and avoiding what you might call theoretical imperialism, trying to make one viewpoint explain everything. Extreme opposites, like radical behaviorism versus hardcore cognitivism, or extreme nativism versus extreme empiricism, are usually mutually exclusive. You can't really hold both simultaneously. But midpoints, like neo-behaviorism bridging stimulus response and internal states, or constructivism bridging innate and learned, often represent coherent attempts to integrate elements.
And you mentioned structuralism and functionalism can often work together.
Yes, because they address complementary aspects, the what's and the how of knowledge. You generally need both categories and rules. They become incompatible usually when specific series make opposing claims about the same specific behavior, like maybe Piaget's logical structures versus Siegler's rules, trying to explain the same conservation task performance. But the underlying MTBSs themselves are often compatible partners.
Okay, so within group combinations are possible, especially around the middle ground or when complementing each other. What about between group combinations, mixing origin, form, and mechanism?
That's often where you see really fruitful theories emerge, because these different groups are fundamentally asking different questions. You can absolutely have a nativist structuralist, like Chomsky, believing in innate grammatical structures, or an empiricist functionalist, like early AI researchers Newell and Simon, focusing on learned problem-solving procedures, or a constructivist structuralist, Piaget, or a constructivist functionalist, maybe Resnick's work on math learning. The key is whether the core tenets clash. Radical behaviorism clashes with structuralism functionalism because it denies the causal role of mental representations. But neo-behaviorism or cognitivism can combine with structural functional views.
And behaviorism generally aligns with empiricism, right? Not so much nativism or constructivism.
Right, because the focus is on learning from environmental input. It's also perfectly sensible, of course, to believe that different MTBSs might apply best to different domains of knowledge or learning. Maybe some things are more innate, others more constructed, others more learned through association.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not necessarily one size fits all. Can you give us some concrete examples of theories that successfully synthesized different MTBSs?
Absolutely. Robbie Case's neo-Piagetian theory is a fantastic example. It explicitly fuses Piaget's stage theory, which is structuralist in its focus on developing mental representations and operations, with information processing ideas, which are functionalist. Case talks about how automatization of skills, functionalist process, frees up limited working memory capacity, functionalist constraint, allowing more complex structures, structuralist, to be built. He also keeps that constructivist core children actively construct these representations and strategies. He even brings in biological maturation, like myelinization increasing processing speed, as enabling these shifts.
So it blends structure, process, and development within a constructivist frame.
Exactly. And because structuralism and functionalism are often compatible, and he embeds them within constructivism, it hangs together coherently.
Okay, that's a great example. What's another one?
John Anderson's ACT theory is another classic synthesis. It explicitly combines declarative knowledge, facts, concepts, often represented in network structures, which leans structuralist, with procedural knowledge, skills, how-to, represented as if-then production rules. Definitely functionalist.
So structuralist, what, and functionalist, how?
Precisely. And the learning part of ACT, how you acquire new procedures, leans heavily empiricist. It involves things like using general strategies, learning from examples, discriminating and generalizing based on feedback, and strengthening connections based on practice and success, very much learning from experience.
So that's an empiricist, functionalist, structuralist blend.
You could definitely characterize it that way, yeah.
Yeah.
It shows how you can coherently combine views on the form of knowledge, both declarative structures and procedural rules, with a view on its origin, primarily learned through experience and refinement.
These examples really drive home how understanding the underlying MTBSs lets you see the logic behind these complex theories and how they fit different pieces together.
Exactly. It moves beyond just memorizing theory names and helps you grasp the fundamental assumptions and how they allow for or prevent integration.
This has been incredibly clarifying. So, the big takeaway for everyone listening is that potentially confusing landscape of learning theories. It actually has an underlying logic based on these core beliefs, MTBSs, about knowledge, its origin, and how the mind works. Understanding these gives you a powerful framework to make sense of it all, to see the connections, and to evaluate how different ideas might fit together. We've really tried to unpack those core assumptions in this deep dive.
And hopefully this framework isn't just academic, but gives you a new lens to view your own learning and maybe even how you approach teaching or explaining things to others.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought to chew on. Given this framework of different fundamental beliefs, structuralism, functionalism, nativism, empiricism, constructivism, behaviorism, cognitivism, think about your own learning, are there areas where consciously applying one of these lenses might be particularly helpful? When you're learning a complex new concept, maybe focusing on the structure helps. When learning a skill, focusing on the process. Could recognizing the interplay between innate tendencies, experience, and your own active construction lead to better strategies? Which MTBSs do you think best explain how you learn different things? Something to ponder. Until our next deep dive, keep exploring.